When I first bought that stretch of land on the outskirts of Willow Creek, I didn't think much about homeowners associations or suburban politics. I wasn't even planning on developing it. To me, that 120-acre plot was a piece of peace, rolling hills, soft soil, and a ribbon of creek running through the middle that glittered in the sunlight like a strand of silver. I bought it after years of working construction management across half the country, saving every dime, pouring every drop of sweat into projects that made other men rich. This was supposed to be my sanctuary. My place to breathe, to fish, to watch the sun fall behind the oak ridge without anyone telling me where to park my truck or what color my fence had to be. But peace, I would learn, doesn't last long when greed smells fresh soil. It started quietly, almost innocently. A few surveyors began showing up around the northern border of my land about 2 years after I bought it. I figured they were county workers, maybe something about the highway expansion I'd heard whispers about. I didn't pay much attention. Then came the excavators. I drove out one morning to check my fences and saw them parked along the ridge, engines humming, yellow machines stretching like beasts under the morning sun. That's when I realized this wasn't just county business. Something was being built. At first, I thought maybe someone had bought the neighboring lot and construction had bled over onto my side. But when I checked the county plat maps, the shock nearly stopped my heart. The new development, Whispering Pines Estates, a 96-home subdivision, was entirely mapped over my parcel. Every inch of it. Roads, utilities, drainage systems, everything. The survey lines weren't even close. They were exactly aligned with my deed's coordinates. I drove straight to the county recorder's office, demanded an explanation, and the clerk just blinked at me like I was crazy. According to their database, that land had been zoned, approved, and deed transferred to a homeowners association called Whispering Pines HOA. But that was impossible. I never sold it. I had the original deed, my name, my signature, my notary seal, all locked up in my safe. I'd paid my property taxes every single year. I had receipts, paper trails, everything. Yet when I pressed for more information, the clerk told me something that chilled my blood. Sir, according to our system, your deed was voided 5 years ago after the land was reclassified under County Development Ordinance 14B. I asked who signed that ordinance. She gave me a name, Paul Brennan, the same man who sat as president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association Council and happened to be one of the largest local real estate developers in the county. I remember standing in that office, jaw clenched, trying to understand how an HOA had managed to claim ownership of my land without me knowing. I went home, dug through every document I had, every email, every tax receipt. Everything was legal, clean, and mine. Yet somehow, on paper, it wasn't. Over the next few weeks, the noise from construction grew louder, chainsaws, dump trucks, concrete mixers, hammering late into the night. My land was becoming someone else's dream neighborhood. I called the county office again and again, got nowhere. I contacted Brennan's development company, Brennan & Sons Real Estate, and was told the usual corporate nonsense: we believe this is a misunderstanding. Our records show we own the land legally. They sent me PDFs, fake deeds, forged signatures, and an approval letter supposedly from me authorizing construction. My signature looked similar, but I knew my hand. It wasn't mine. It was forged. I knew then that I wasn't just dealing with a paperwork error, I was staring down a web of corruption. I wanted to storm down there and shut the whole operation down, but something in me told me to wait. My father always used to say, "Son, never wrestle pigs, they like the mud, and you'll just get dirty." I decided to watch. To document. To let them build every inch, pour every driveway, and lay every brick. Because once they were done, once they'd invested millions, I'd pull the rug right out from under them, with the very piece of paper they thought didn't exist anymore, the original deed. So I played the fool. I stayed quiet. I kept my distance. I let them believe they'd gotten away with it. Meanwhile, I gathered evidence, photographs, drone footage, timestamps, county inspection reports, and every single name attached to that project. It took 2 years for the development to fully rise: 96 houses, a clubhouse, 2 parks, and a gated entrance with a fancy stone sign that read, "Welcome to Whispering Pines." Every morning, I'd drive by and watch families moving in, kids on bikes, people planting mailboxes on what they thought was their property. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know that beneath their perfectly manicured lawns lay my land, stolen from me by men in suits who thought they'd never be caught. But they didn't know who I was. Before I bought that land, I'd spent 15 years managing multi-million-dollar construction projects and property developments. I knew contracts, zoning laws, and the loopholes that most lawyers overlooked. I'd worked for the same county once, long enough to know exactly where the skeletons were buried, and who buried them. The more I uncovered, the uglier it got. The county assessor's office had been paid off to correct my records. The building permits were approved without environmental review. Even the electric company had been given falsified right-of-way easements. It wasn't just fraud, it was organized, coordinated, and deliberate. Brennan and his HOA cronies had built an empire by targeting absentee landowners, forging transfer papers, and building over stolen parcels. I just happened to be the first one who noticed, and the worst one they could have crossed. When the last house was finished and the HOA held its grand opening barbecue, I was there, standing quietly on the edge of the crowd. Brennan gave his little speech about community and progress. I almost laughed when I saw him slice the ribbon and declare Whispering Pines officially open. He didn't recognize me. But I recognized him. I recognized the arrogance in his grin, the same one I'd seen in too many boardrooms. He thought the land under his feet was his. He thought he'd beaten me. That night, I went home, unlocked my safe, and pulled out the original deed. The embossed seal still caught the light perfectly. It was real. Untouched. Immutable. I made certified copies, notarized duplicates, and sent them to 3 different law firms I'd worked with in the past. The next morning, I filed a claim in county court, Doe vs. Whispering Pines HOA et al., for unlawful possession, construction on private land, and deed forgery. It didn't take long for the storm to hit. The first letters went out to every homeowner in Whispering Pines, notice of legal action concerning property ownership and title irregularities. The panic spread like wildfire. Realtors stopped answering calls. Banks froze mortgages. The HOA scrambled to contact Brennan's office, who assured them everything would be fine. But it wasn't fine. Because 2 weeks later, I walked into court, set my original deed on the judge's desk, and let the room fall silent. The day I walked into that courtroom, I wasn't wearing a suit or fancy tie like Brennan and his lawyers. I wore my old leather jacket, work boots, and the same jeans I'd worn the day I first bought that land. My attorney, Jack Raines, a sharp but quiet man I'd known since my construction days, told me to keep my cool, no matter how ugly it got. He'd seen the kind of power we were going up against. Brennan wasn't just some local developer anymore. He was deep in the county's political system, with council members, inspectors, and bankers all feeding from the same trough. But I wasn't afraid. I knew I had something they couldn't fake, buy, or manipulate, the truth, inked on an original legal deed, sealed and recorded before half of Brennan's board ever existed. As I stepped inside the courtroom, I could feel eyes on me. On one side sat the HOA's board members, dressed like they were attending a country club meeting, pearls, pressed collars, smug grins. On the other sat a cluster of homeowners, faces pale and anxious. They didn't know who I was yet. They probably thought I was some angry neighbor protesting the noise or the construction. Brennan, seated at the center of the defense table, gave me that same fake smile I'd seen at his grand opening ceremony. To him, I was just another obstacle, one he could bulldoze with paperwork and influence. The judge entered, an older man named Judge Daniels, the kind who had seen decades of corruption and probably assumed this was just another land dispute. The clerk called the case number, and the courtroom quieted. My attorney stood, calm and composed, and began with the opening statement. Your Honor, Jack said, sliding a leather folder across the table, this case isn't about confusion or mistaken identity. It's about theft, plain and simple. My client, Mr. Robert Hayes, is the legal owner of the land currently occupied by what is now called Whispering Pines Estates. This isn't an opinion, it's fact, proven by the original deed, notarized and recorded long before any development took place. The defense snickered. Brennan's lead attorney, a slick man named Pearson, leaned forward and responded with a smirk. Your Honor, we have already presented certified documents showing that the land in question was rightfully transferred to the Willow Creek Development Authority, and subsequently to Whispering Pines HOA, through proper county channels. Whatever document Mr. Hayes has is outdated or, more likely, invalidated by Ordinance 14B. Judge Daniels raised an eyebrow. We'll see. Mr. Hayes, please step forward. I stood up, feeling every heartbeat echo in my chest. I walked to the bench, placed my worn folder on the judge's desk, and opened it slowly. Inside was the original deed, sealed with the notary stamp, recorded in 2015, 5 years before any construction began. The paper wasn't a copy. It wasn't a scan. It was the real thing, embossed and official. When the judge compared my deed with the county's records, his brow furrowed. He looked between the two documents several times, then glanced up at the defense. Mr. Pearson, according to this document, Mr. Hayes is the rightful owner of this parcel. How exactly was it reclassified without his consent? Pearson shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, as we mentioned, under Ordinance 14B, the county authorized reclassification for developmental purposes. The previous deed was legally superseded. Jack immediately countered, with respect, Your Honor, that ordinance was passed in 2020, 5 years after Mr. Hayes' deed was recorded. Ordinance 14B applies only to county-owned land designated for development, not private property. Furthermore, the ordinance explicitly states that reclassification cannot occur without the property owner's written consent. Daniels turned back to Brennan. Did you have that consent, Mr. Brennan? Brennan's jaw tightened. We have documentation. Let's see it, the judge said. Pearson handed over a neatly stapled packet, scanned forms, letters, and a signature that looked eerily similar to mine. The judge examined it closely, then looked up. Mr. Hayes, is this your signature? I leaned in, studying the slanted loops and uneven tail of the Y in my last name. My voice was steady when I answered. No, Your Honor. That's a forgery. I can prove it. Jack handed the judge a document from our side, an affidavit from the notary who had authenticated my actual signature, along with a handwriting expert's analysis. The expert's conclusion was clear, forged. Daniels leaned back, his expression shifting from neutral to skeptical toward the defense. Mr. Pearson, you understand the gravity of what I'm seeing here. Forging a property deed is a felony. Brennan tried to interject, Your Honor, I had no knowledge, but the judge cut him off sharply. Then perhaps you should have. Because as of right now, it appears your entire development was constructed on land your company did not own. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Homeowners gasped, some whispering frantically, others staring at Brennan in disbelief. Pearson tried to regain control, filing motions to delay, to reevaluate the documents, but Daniels wasn't having it. He scheduled an evidentiary hearing for the following week and ordered that all property transfers within Whispering Pines be temporarily frozen until ownership could be confirmed. That single ruling hit Brennan like a wrecking ball. The banks froze his accounts. The title insurance companies refused to process closings. Buyers backed out. Construction crews stopped showing up. And suddenly, the people living in Whispering Pines started asking questions Brennan couldn't answer. I drove by the neighborhood that evening. The once pristine entrance looked different now, nervous faces behind curtains, HOA members pacing on their lawns, a "for sale" sign half torn from the ground. Some recognized me. One woman actually came up to my truck. "Are you really the owner?" she asked, trembling. "We bought our home 2 years ago, we have kids, are we going to lose it?" Her voice cracked. And that moment hit me harder than I expected. These weren't the villains. These were people who trusted the wrong man. I didn't want to destroy their lives, I wanted justice from the man who built his empire on deceit. I told her, "Ma'am, you're not my enemy. I'm going after the people who lied to you. Not you." When the hearing resumed a week later, Brennan came armed with more paperwork, but it was useless. Jack had subpoenaed the county's internal emails, and what we found blew the lid off everything. There were messages between Brennan and the county assessor's office, explicit discussions about adjusting parcel boundaries and expediting title clearance. There was even one email that said, "Don't worry, Hayes will never find out. He's just a farmer." When that line was read aloud in court, Brennan's face went white. The judge's gavel slammed. "Enough," he barked. "Mr. Brennan, this court finds significant evidence of fraud, forgery, and unlawful development." But Daniels didn't rule that day. He ordered a full forensic audit of every file related to Whispering Pines. He wanted every signature, every payment, every approval scrutinized. That audit took months, and it exposed more than any of us imagined. It turned out Brennan had been running this same scam for nearly a decade. He'd forged or manipulated deeds, paid off clerks, and sold land he didn't own to developers who didn't bother to verify ownership. Whispering Pines was just the biggest, and the sloppiest. By the time the audit was complete, the county's corruption network was laid bare. A deputy clerk resigned. The county surveyor was arrested. And Brennan's company was drowning under the weight of civil and criminal charges. But the biggest blow came 6 months later, during the final hearing. The courtroom was packed, standing room only. The media was there, cameras rolling. Brennan looked like a shell of himself, eyes sunken, hands shaking. Judge Daniels took his seat, shuffled the papers before him, and spoke clearly. "After reviewing the evidence, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Robert Hayes. The land known as Whispering Pines Estates is hereby declared the sole legal property of Mr. Hayes. All existing titles, mortgages, and HOA claims are null and void." The gavel came down hard. You could have heard a pin drop. Then, chaos. Homeowners gasped, reporters swarmed, and Brennan buried his face in his hands. I just stood there, silent, still, as it sank in. I'd done it. I'd pulled the deed right out from under them, just like I'd promised myself. But my fight wasn't over yet. Because now, I didn't just own Whispering Pines, I owned everything built on top of it. 96 homes, roads, parks, and a clubhouse. And every single one of them legally belonged to me. The news spread faster than wildfire on a windy night. Within 24 hours, my name was everywhere, on the front page of the Willow Creek Gazette, the local TV stations, and eventually on national outlets. Headlines read, "Man reclaims entire neighborhood after court rules HOA built on stolen land." Some called me a hero, others a villain. The homeowners were split, half wanted to thank me for exposing Brennan's corruption, and the other half blamed me for turning their suburban dream into a legal nightmare. But I didn't care much for the noise. What mattered to me was that justice had been served. Still, deep down, I knew I couldn't just walk away now that I technically owned a small city's worth of property. The morning after the verdict, I stood at the top of the hill overlooking Whispering Pines. The mist hung low, curling around rooftops like smoke from an invisible fire. 96 homes lined the neatly paved streets, identical driveways, trimmed lawns, tidy mailboxes. It was like a movie set, too perfect to be real. But it was real, and by law, it was mine. I could have ordered everyone off that land if I wanted to. I could have bulldozed it flat, fenced it off, and let it all return to the wild. But watching the children ride bikes, the mailman make his rounds, and the families watering their gardens, I realized something. Brennan had built his empire on lies, but these people had built their lives on top of those lies. That afternoon, I called my lawyer Jack and said, "We're not kicking anyone out. Not yet. But I want options, legal ones. I want Brennan held accountable, and I want every homeowner protected." Jack was silent for a moment. "That's not the usual move," he said finally. "You could sell everything back, or charge rent. That land's worth tens of millions now." I looked out at the rows of houses, remembering the years I'd spent building homes for other people, never owning one of my own until that ranch. "Jack," I said, "this isn't about money. It's about making things right, the right way." Over the next few weeks, I worked out a plan. I met with the homeowners in the community clubhouse, the same one Brennan had built as his crown jewel. It was an awkward meeting at first. When I walked in, conversations stopped. Faces turned. A few people glared, others whispered. They all knew who I was by then, the man who technically owned every square inch of their neighborhood. I walked to the front, cleared my throat, and said, "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. You were lied to. You were tricked by a man who thought he could play God with your lives. But I'm not your enemy. My name's Robert Hayes, and I'm the rightful owner of this land. I didn't come here to take your homes. I came to tell you that I'm going to fix what Brennan broke." A man in the front row, tall and red-faced, shot up from his chair. "Fix it? You own our homes. What happens to us now? You going to evict my family?" I met his stare and said firmly, "No. Nobody's getting evicted. I'm creating a new legal agreement. One that gives each of you the chance to stay, fair and square, without owing Brennan's HOA a single cent ever again." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some skeptical, some hopeful. "I'm working with my attorney and the court to restructure this neighborhood," I continued. "You'll get legitimate deeds under your names, backed by me, the rightful landowner. And Brennan," I paused, my jaw tightening, "he'll be paying for every single piece of it, one way or another." By the end of that meeting, the tension had eased. A few people even clapped. Not everyone trusted me yet, but for the first time since the court ruling, there was a spark of hope in their eyes. While I began setting up the new agreements, Brennan's world continued to collapse. The district attorney charged him with multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. He tried every trick in the book, appeals, stall tactics, claiming ignorance, but the evidence was ironclad. The county clerk's testimony sealed his fate. She admitted she'd been taking bribes to adjust property records. Brennan had paid her thousands to erase and reassign deeds, including mine. When the trial came, I attended every session. I sat behind him in the courtroom, silent but steady, watching as his empire crumbled piece by piece. The prosecutors laid everything bare, the fake documents, the payoffs, the insider connections. By the end, even Brennan's own lawyers looked sick. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours before finding him guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in federal prison and ordered restitution. Every asset he owned was to be liquidated to compensate his victims. That included his properties, vehicles, and even the marble-floored mansion he'd built with stolen money. The day they took him away in handcuffs, I didn't feel joy. I didn't cheer or gloat. I just stood outside the courthouse as the reporters shouted questions, the cameras flashing in my eyes. "Mr. Hayes, what are you going to do with the land now?" one asked. I smiled faintly. "I'm going to build something honest." That night, I went back to my ranch house, the one place untouched by all the chaos, and sat on the porch. The moon hung low over the fields, the same creek whispering through the dark. I thought about my father, about how he told me to always stand my ground no matter who tried to move me. I imagined him sitting there beside me, nodding with that quiet approval of his. Over the next 6 months, we turned the chaos into progress. I hired surveyors, title agents, and independent auditors to clean up every record connected to Whispering Pines. I established a new association, not an HOA in the traditional sense, but a cooperative trust. Each homeowner would own their plot outright, without control by some board or corporate entity. I made sure no one would ever again be forced to paint their door a certain color, or fined for a kid's bicycle left in the driveway. But as with every story of redemption, not everyone appreciated it. A small group of homeowners filed a civil suit against me, claiming emotional distress over the uncertainty caused by the court case. I didn't fight them hard, I understood their fear. Instead, I met with them privately, explained the situation, and helped them settle. Most of them dropped the case afterward. Meanwhile, the media couldn't get enough of it. They started calling me the man who beat the HOA. It wasn't a title I asked for, but it stuck. I started receiving letters from people all over the country, folks who'd been bullied or extorted by their own homeowners associations. Some of their stories were heartbreaking: elderly couples fined for flower pots, veterans threatened over flagpoles, single mothers sued over fences. Each story carried the same thread of abuse of power. And that's when an idea started forming in my mind, something bigger than just fixing Whispering Pines. If one HOA could be brought down for corruption, maybe others could too. Maybe it was time someone stood up for the everyday people these organizations trampled over in the name of community standards. I called Jack one evening and told him, I want to start something, a legal defense foundation for homeowners. I've seen how they operate, how they scare people who don't have the time or money to fight back. We can change that. He was quiet for a long moment, then chuckled softly. You never stop, do you? No, I said, smiling. Not when I know I'm right. And just like that, we laid the groundwork for what would become the Homeowners Justice Foundation. Whispering Pines slowly transformed from a symbol of corruption into a beacon of change. We held community meetings, planted trees, repaired sidewalks, and turned the old HOA office into a public library. The people who once feared me now waved when I drove through the neighborhood. Some even invited me to their barbecues. Kids rode past shouting, "Hey, Mr. Hayes." It was strange, surreal even. The land that had been stolen from me was now a thriving, honest community, one that respected the man who refused to bow to greed. But deep inside, I knew the fight wasn't over. Brennan's empire might have fallen, but there were dozens like him across the country, men hiding behind polished logos and legal jargon, using fear and fines to control people. I'd just proven that they weren't untouchable. And I wasn't done proving it yet. A year passed after the Whispering Pines verdict, but life didn't slow down for me. If anything, it became even more intense. The court victory had made me something of an unintentional public figure. Reporters still called, journalists still sent interview requests, and people from all over the country reached out with their own HOA horror stories. My phone rang every day, families desperate for help, veterans losing their homes to bogus fines, retirees being sued for lawn decorations. It was endless. But every voice that reached out only strengthened my resolve. I didn't start the Homeowners Justice Foundation to make a name for myself. I started it because I'd seen firsthand what unchecked power could do. HOAs were supposed to protect communities, not dominate them. Yet somewhere along the line, many had turned into private dictatorships, mini-governments with no oversight, run by egos instead of ethics. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized Brennan was just the tip of the iceberg. My foundation began small, just me, Jack, and a handful of volunteers working out of an old converted barn on my ranch. We called it the shop, because that's what it felt like, a place where we repaired what was broken, piece by piece. People sent us legal documents, complaints, letters, photos. We analyzed them, connected them with pro bono attorneys, and built cases. Some were simple, unlawful fees or discrimination. Others were massive, involving millions in stolen funds. Within 6 months, we'd already helped overturn 3 fraudulent HOA rulings in neighboring counties. But our biggest case came from a quiet little town called Pine Ridge. A group of homeowners there had discovered their HOA president had been pocketing community maintenance funds for years. When they tried to hold him accountable, he fined them, threatened them, and even had their mailboxes removed for non-compliance. When one family refused to pay, he foreclosed on their home. The local sheriff enforced it, not realizing the entire process was illegal. When that case landed on my desk, it hit me hard. It was like looking at Brennan's corruption all over again, just in a different disguise. I drove to Pine Ridge myself, met with the families, and listened to their stories. Most of them were too scared to fight back. They'd seen what happened when people crossed the HOA before. One older man, a retired Navy engineer named Frank, shook my hand and said, "Mr. Hayes, you don't know what it's like living under these people. They own the board, the bank, the sheriff, the whole damn county. You can't beat them." I looked him in the eye and said, "Frank, that's what they said about Whispering Pines too." Within 2 weeks, we filed a lawsuit, Hayes Foundation vs. Pine Ridge HOA. This time, I wasn't the victim. I was the one bringing the fight. And word spread fast. The HOA's lawyers tried to intimidate us with motions and threats, but it only fueled us more. We had evidence. Bank records, falsified budgets, emails showing kickbacks. It was airtight. When the case finally went to court, the HOA president, Carl Dempsey, walked in with that same arrogance I'd seen in Brennan. He looked at me across the room and smirked. "You think you're some kind of crusader, Hayes? You're just another guy with a grudge." I leaned back and replied evenly, "No, Carl. I'm the guy who knows how this game is played, and I don't lose." The trial was brutal, drawn out for months. But every time their lawyers tried to twist the facts, we hit back with undeniable proof. Homeowners testified about threats, hidden fees, even falsified ballots in board elections. One witness broke down crying on the stand, describing how her family had been forced out of their house for missing a $75 lawn violation fine. It was sickening, but powerful. When the verdict came, it was unanimous. The court dissolved the Pine Ridge HOA, ordered Dempsey to repay over $2 million in stolen funds, and banned him from holding any public or corporate office ever again. The look on his face as the gavel dropped reminded me of Brennan's, a mix of disbelief and fear. That victory lit a fire across the country. Media outlets started calling it the HOA revolution. Our foundation grew faster than I could have imagined. Donations poured in. Lawyers volunteered. Whistleblowers came forward. Before long, we weren't just fighting one HOA at a time, we were influencing policy. We drafted model legislation called the Homeowner Protection Act, which aimed to regulate HOAs under state and federal oversight. It required transparency, capped fines, and guaranteed due process for every homeowner. I took it to the state legislature myself. Standing there in front of the committee, I told my story from start to finish, how they'd built 96 homes on my land, how I'd waited, fought, and won. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment before the applause started. It wasn't about me anymore, it was about everyone who'd ever been silenced, bullied, or stolen from. The bill passed unanimously in committee, and within 6 months, it was signed into law. That day, I went back to Whispering Pines, parked by the same stone sign that once made my blood boil, and just stood there. The neighborhood was thriving. Kids played on the sidewalks, gardens bloomed, and laughter echoed through the streets. I'd given them their homes, their land, and their freedom. But more than that, I'd given them a voice. As I walked down the street, a little boy ran up to me holding a baseball glove. "Hey, Mr. Hayes. You gonna play with us?" I smiled and knelt down. "Maybe next time, champ. You keep practicing that throw." His mother waved from her porch and mouthed, "Thank you." Moments like that reminded me why I'd started all this. Not for fame. Not for vengeance. But because people deserve to live without fear of someone else's control. That night, as I sat by the creek behind my ranch, I thought about how far things had come. The same water that once reflected my anger now shimmered with peace. My father's old words echoed in my mind, "Don't wrestle pigs, son. Just build your fence higher." I smiled to myself. I'd done more than build a fence, I'd built a wall of truth around people who needed protection. But I also knew one thing for certain: corruption never sleeps. As long as there was money, power, and land, there'd always be another Brennan or Dempsey waiting for a chance to exploit it. And I'd be waiting for them. Because I wasn't just Robert Hayes, the man who got his land back anymore. I'd become something else, something the corrupt feared. The man who pulled the deed in court, and never stopped fighting afterward. By the second anniversary of the Whispering Pines ruling, my life had completely transformed. What started as a personal fight to reclaim what was mine had evolved into a national movement. The Homeowners Justice Foundation had grown from a handful of volunteers in my ranch barn into a fully operational network of attorneys, investigators, and policy experts working across 8 states. We had opened field offices, built an online database to track abusive HOAs, and even partnered with investigative journalists to expose large-scale real estate fraud. But despite all the media attention, I never forgot where it began, on that quiet piece of land, stolen and paved over by arrogance. One crisp autumn morning, I drove back to that same hill overlooking Whispering Pines. The air was cool and clean, and the sunrise spilled gold over the rooftops. The community had come a long way. The streets, once symbols of corruption, were now lined with trees we planted together during the first rebuild day. Neighbors talked over fences, kids played in the cul-de-sacs, and the clubhouse now doubled as a community learning center offering free financial literacy classes. The sign at the entrance still read Whispering Pines, but someone had added a smaller plaque beneath it that said, "Founded on justice, not greed." I parked my truck by the curb and stepped out. A few homeowners waved as I passed, and I waved back. These were the same people who had once looked at me with fear, the same ones who thought I'd come to take their homes away. Now, they smiled. They trusted me. I'd become something of a guardian to this place, though I never asked for the title. I just wanted it to stand as proof that the powerful could be held accountable, and that integrity could still win. Jack met me near the old clubhouse steps. He'd aged a little in those 2 years, gray streaks in his beard, deeper lines around his eyes, but that same calm grin was there. "You've built quite a thing here, Rob," he said, handing me a coffee. "You know, most people would have sold this land for a fortune and disappeared." I took a sip and smiled faintly. "Most people never had it stolen from them, Jack. When you lose something like this and fight tooth and nail to get it back, you don't measure its value in dollars anymore." He nodded, understanding without needing more words. We walked down the main street, past the new park. A group of children were playing on swings while their parents chatted nearby. The houses glowed with the soft amber light of early morning. It was peaceful, the kind of peace I had dreamed of when I first bought this land all those years ago. Jack said quietly, "You know, they're talking about you in D.C. Some senators want you to testify about HOA reform nationwide." I chuckled. "Testify, huh? Guess I'll need to buy a better jacket." He smirked. "Maybe 2. I didn't know it then, but that hearing would become another turning point. A few months later, I found myself sitting in front of a congressional committee, rows of cameras and microphones pointed at me. Lawmakers asked about my case, about the loopholes that allowed HOAs and developers to manipulate property laws. I told them everything, how it started with one fake ordinance, one greedy man, and one quiet landowner who refused to be intimidated. When I finished, the room erupted in applause. That day, they announced a bipartisan initiative to review and reform HOA governance nationwide. For once, politics took a back seat to justice. But not everyone was happy about it. Behind the scenes, powerful real estate lobbies started pushing back. They called me a dangerous populist, a threat to private development, even a vigilante. They tried to dig up dirt, smear my name, twist my story. One article claimed I had secretly profited from the Whispering Pines turnover, that I'd used my foundation to funnel donations for personal gain. Jack called me late one night, furious. "We can sue them for defamation, Rob. Shut them down." But I told him no. Let them talk. People who need the truth already know it. The rest aren't worth the fight. The attacks didn't slow us down. In fact, they only brought us more attention. Donations doubled. Volunteers tripled. Whistleblowers came forward from HOA boards, banks, and even local governments. We exposed over a dozen fraudulent schemes, ghost associations, stolen property deeds, and illegal foreclosures. Every case reminded me of Brennan, of the arrogance that once stood on my soil, thinking it could never fall. Meanwhile, Brennan himself wasn't doing well. Word reached me that he'd been transferred to a federal penitentiary after an altercation. Some said he'd been trying to appeal his sentence, others said he'd lost his mind. I didn't care much either way. Justice had already done its job. But one day, a letter arrived at my foundation's office, written in shaky handwriting. The return address, Federal Correctional Institution, Greenville. It was from him. The letter was short, only one paragraph. "Hayes, you were right. I thought money made me untouchable. I thought land was power. But standing behind these walls, I finally understand, it was never about the land. It was about what kind of man owns it. You earned yours. I stole mine. You won. Brennan." I read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. Not out of pity, but because it was a strange kind of closure. The man who once stood above the law was now just another reminder of what greed destroys. Months passed. The foundation grew. We launched a national awareness campaign called Own What's Yours to educate homeowners on their rights. I spoke at universities, legal conferences, even small-town gatherings where folks shared stories that sounded painfully familiar to my own. Every time, I told them the same thing: they can write laws. They can make rules. But they can't take what you rightfully own, not if you stand your ground. One evening, as I sat on my porch, the same creek whispering through the dusk, I thought about everything that had happened. From the day I saw those first surveyors on my land to this moment, it felt like a lifetime. I had gone from a quiet man living on a ranch to the face of a national reform movement. And though I'd lost peace for a time, I'd found purpose. The wind carried the scent of pine and wet earth. I could hear the faint laughter of families from the nearby neighborhood, the same one that once rose out of corruption. Now, it stood as a symbol of redemption. I smiled to myself, thinking how ironic it was that they still called it Whispering Pines. Maybe that was fitting. Because beneath those trees, the land no longer whispered of lies, it whispered of justice. Jack once told me, "You know, Rob, most people fight their whole lives for a piece of land. You fought for what that land stood for." He was right. My fight was never about property lines or fences, it was about principle. About proving that integrity can outlast deceit, and that the truth, once buried under concrete and greed, can still break through the surface like spring grass after winter. As the last light of day faded, I stood, looking out across my ranch. The horizon glowed faintly orange, and the creek shimmered like a promise kept. I thought about my father again, about his words: "The land doesn't make the man. The man makes the land." And as the wind rustled through the trees, I finally understood what he meant. I'd reclaimed my land, yes, but more than that, I'd reclaimed something far greater. My faith in what's right. My belief that justice still lives in the soil of this country. And the quiet, unshakable truth that when you stand your ground, even against an empire of greed, you don't just win back what's yours. You remind the world that no amount of power, paper, or politics can ever rewrite the truth. Because the deed might be ink on paper, but ownership, real ownership, is written in the soul.